Okay, starting now. There you go. So again, welcome, Tina. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thanks everyone for joining us for military genealogy.
Thanks, Anne. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of you being on tonight as well. A little bit about me. I am the owner of Tamarack Genealogy. I'm also the genealogy. I am Anne's counterpart, the genealogy and local history librarian at the Plainfield Public Library and here in Plainfield, Illinois. I have been in that position for what will be 21 years this summer. So I started woefully young. They broke every legal law possible by hiring an infant because there's no way I could be that old to work someplace for 21 years. I teach genealogy classes at my library as well as to other libraries in the state and around the US. Military genealogy is one of my specialties. I do a lot of research, First World War specifically, so I'm glad Tom brought that up. But across all military engagements. So I've researched each of the wars that I'm going to be talking about. So I have a little bit of experience using both local, state, national records, as well as international records, and hopefully that'll come across well for you. I am going to turn my camera off, one, because I have a cold. So every time I rub my nose, you don't have to watch that. But also so that I'm not hogging any bandwidth, so we get a nice, clear presentation without any type of lag. I'll turn my camera on at the end so we can ask questions during the Q&A. Okay, so there's multiple layers when we're dealing with military records that I want you to think about as you're doing your research. I like to think of it like a dartboard or like peeling an onion. You're going to have records that are personal. So you're going to have either the individual veteran or soldier or sailor or nurse in your family. Hopefully there might be some records for them. You're going to have records on the local level, which are going to be things like local library, local historical society, county records, local military service organization records. You're going to have things that are available to you on the state level. So that's going to be things like if they were in a militia unit, or if they were in a National Guard unit, a state unit that was before it was federalized, those records would be on the state level. If they were entitled to any bonuses or pensions that were available to them, those would be on the state level. So there are numerous different things on the state level you can be looking for, as well as things on the national level. So those are kind of the records that Tom was talking about. We're talking about federalized military records, we're talking about discharges, we're talking about pensions, we're talking about any type of land or bounty warrants that they might have been issued. If we're talking about Revolutionary War, War of 1812, soldiers and sailors and things like that. So you have to think about this as concentric rings or concentric circles, and you're going to work from the inside out, and you're going to touch every one of those different layers as you're doing your research. So when we talk about military records, there's more than just the soldier's personal file. There's more things that are unit-based, things that are military-based in general. So things like newspapers, county histories, first-person diaries, those types of things that could represent the soldier or personally, or things that are written about him in other people's letters and diaries and newspapers accounts. There are things like regimental lists that would be on the state or the federal level, those separation papers. There's lots of different places to look for this type of information than just saying, I need to get a copy of his enlistment record. There are other places where you can gather information as well. So here's an example of really, really valuable, useful information that is available on the local level. So whether it's Civil War, whether it's Revolutionary War, whether it's First World War, county histories are really an absolute gem when it comes to finding out about military service. And these are one of those records that are available on the local level at your local library. But a lot of organizations have digitized these and have made these available online nationally. So whether it's Google Books, whether it's HathiTrust, whether it's Internet Archive like this one is, you don't necessarily have to be in that county or at that library in order to access the same information. So if I had an idea that the Offerman brothers had served in the First World War, but I didn't have any information about where or when or which ones, this particular county history from 1923 provides me a lot of information. So it tells me that Albert Offerman served. It tells me that his brother Leo had served. It gives me information about several of the brothers who had served, whether they had gone overseas, whether they were stationed in France, whether they had stayed locally. And while it doesn't tell me their service number or tell me the unit that they were in, it still provides enough information for me to go looking other places. So it tells me Albert and Leo had served, but the article itself is about Alois, who also served. Tells me that he was in the US Army, that he was in officers training school at DePaul University. I'm going to go contact DePaul to find out some additional information about the training school. But then at the very bottom, it also tells me that he was a member of his local American Legion, Harwood Post number 5. I'm going to talk about American Legion records in just a second. So take advantage of the things that you can find on your local level. So if I stumble across this, because I just did a search on Internet Archive and I did a search for Leo or Albert or Alois Offerman, I might stumble across this. And this one county history can lead me to 3 or 4 or 5 different pieces of information. So then I'm going to reach out to the local historical society. I'm going to reach out to the local library. I'm going to take a look in the local cemetery, see if he's buried, if they're buried with military markers. I'm going to see on the state level if there happens to be anything about him. Since they were in Will County, and this would be true for you, whether it's Kane County, Lake County, McHenry County, anywhere in Illinois, and even outside of Illinois, if you reach out to the county courthouse and you, in Illinois specifically, if you contact the recorder of deeds, the recorder of deeds was the one that was responsible for handling all military discharges because they were recording important objects that needed to be recorded for the record. So not only were they handling things like deeds, they were handling things like incorporations of businesses, maps of cemeteries, all kinds of things that are important. So as soldiers are being discharged and they're coming back to their county to register their discharge papers to show that they're in good standing, then if the county has a copy of that discharge, which I'm going to search for because thanks to this county history, it tells me that, well, at least 3 of the sons should have been discharged out of Will County. I can go looking for them. And on those records, on those discharge papers, it's going to give me height, weight, hair color, unit they're in. It's going to give me their service number, their dates of service. It's going to tell me whether they were wounded in action. It's going to provide, in most cases, what their date of birth is, where they were born, which could potentially be information that you're seeking, what their occupation was before they joined the service, and where they were living after. So those are all really, really important pieces of the puzzle. And all of those could be found just by stumbling across this one biography that was written in a county history. So on the local level, there are lots of things that you can find. So now that I know that in this one that Albert served in the 2nd Engineers in France and that he was gassed and shell-shocked, I'm going to go looking for information about the 2nd Engineers. What did they see? Where did they go? What kinds of things did they experience? I'm going to reach out to someplace like Veterans Oral History Project with the Library of Congress, and I'm going to be looking for any stories that relate to the 2nd Engineers. Or I'm going to be looking in local newspapers for articles about the 2nd Engineers. Even if Albert isn't listed, anything about the 2nd Engineers is still going to tell me what he experienced, even if he's not listed directly. So there's lots of bits and pieces to this that you can pull out just by stumbling across this one article. But speaking of the American Legion, in order to join a military service organization, you have to prove that you had served in the military. So whether that's the American Legion, whether that's the VFW, whether that's the Grand Army of the Republic or Sons of the Confederacy, they would have had to have supplied information about their military experience. So in this particular case, for Mr. Kinder, it tells me that he was stationed with the American Expeditionary Forces in France during the First World War, that he was overseas in Germany, gives me the dates of his military service, tells me that he was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and gives the dates. While it doesn't give his specific unit or his service number, sometimes the application will. So if you know that you had an ancestor that had joined one of these organizations, you have a VFW hat, or you have something else that shows they were in military service organizations, anywhere they may have lived. So if they had fought in the Civil War from Cuyahoga County, Ohio, and then they moved to Chicago, and then they moved to Des Moines, and then they moved to Denver, I would be looking in each one of those places and reaching out to the service organizations in that place, because if they were members of one, they were probably members of all of them. And each one could provide a different piece of the puzzle for your soldier. So county level records, local level records, municipal records can be really, really valuable. So photographs too, reach out to your local historical society, reach out to the local library, see if they happen to have any photos of units or photos of events, veterans photos. In Plainfield, there's a photo that has the surviving Civil War soldiers from, I think it's 1907, that has about 17, 18 guys standing on the steps to the local Methodist church. And on the backside, it has all of their names listed. Doesn't tell me anything about their service, but it gives me a clue to go looking for additional information. So photos can be really, really valuable. I'm notorious for reaching out to local historical and genealogical societies and say, can I see your unidentified military photos? And they look at me like I'm a little cracked. Why would you want to see the unidentified ones? Because I might recognize my own ancestor. Or it might be a Grand Army of the Republic meeting, and it's a photo of the officers of the Grand Army of the Republic post, or VFW picnic, and 2 out of 15 people might be named, but I might be able to find my ancestor and say, you know, there's Uncle Bob right there. Now there's 3 people named. So even those unknowns or unidentifieds could be very valuable, because it could be your ancestor, your uncle, your dad, you know, your great grandfather that you recognize from other photos that you can then help them as much as helping yourself. Online databases, each one of our libraries, Algonquin is no exception. We have access to all kinds of local genealogical databases and things that we've put together, whether it's obit indexes, newspapers that we've scanned and digitized, cemetery records. You can go through those and glean out any type of military service, as well as national genealogical and military records databases that are out there. So a lot of the ones that I'm going to talk about throughout the course of my presentation are ones that you already have access to through Algonquin. You already have access to Fold 3, you already have access to Find My Past, you already have access to Heritage Quest. So all of these are valuable resources to you. If you want to know more about the state, for example, if you had somebody who served from a state militia unit or a state a state Army unit or Navy unit in Illinois, if you go to the Secretary of State's website and take a look at their military databases, they have inventories and indexes of soldiers and sailors who have served from Illinois. We are in no way the only state that does this. Wisconsin Historical Society, or if you reach out to the Wisconsin Military Museum, they have some wonderful collections with rosters of soldiers for their state. You guys hear me talk about Michigan all the time. I absolutely adore Chris and the collections at the Michigan State Archives. Michiganology is no exception. They have a lot of records available for you about not only veterans who served, but Michigan also did a post-World War I survey, census of returning veterans, to ask them, like, how did you enjoy the war? They asked some really strange questions, like, has your view of religion changed since you've returned from the war? They're really intriguing questions, but Michigan did one of those surveys after the war. Sadly, Illinois did not. But each state did something slightly different. So it's always worth it to kind of investigate on the state level. Did they do a post-war pension? Did they do a post-war bonus? Did they do a post-war census or survey like Michigan and Virginia did? So, you know, you want to really look at all of these different places, these little nooks and crannies, to kind of ferret out all of that information. And when I mention newspapers, the one thing I want to point out about newspapers is that they don't always mention down to the individual soldier level. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's the the unit level. Sometimes it's the company level. Sometimes it's just the division. So it depends. So you have to think about it just like you're peeling that onion for local, state, and federal records. You're peeling that onion, looking for your soldier, looking for the company, looking for the unit, looking for the division, looking for the army, and just working your way up to see what's available. And on newspapers specifically, there are several layers to that as well. So for example, in Plainfield where I work, the Plainfield Enterprise had a column where they would constantly post letters or excerpts of letters from soldiers who were writing home, either to their parents and their parents brought the letter in, or directly to the editor of the newspaper saying, hey, thanks for sending us the newspapers for free. We appreciate it. Here's what's going on. And it's usually kind of giving you information about where they're stationed, roughly what they're doing, maybe their unit. But not only is the local paper reporting on that young man or that nurse or that sailor, but regional newspapers are as well. So we didn't have a base near us in Plainfield, but if you think about Camp Grant in Rockford, Plainfield's reporting on what's going on at Camp Grant, Aurora's reporting on it, Algonquin, everybody's reporting on what's going on at Camp Grant. Plus, the city of Rockford is also reporting on what's going on at Camp Grant. Rockford had 5 different newspapers during the First World War, and all 5 of them were reporting on what was going on at Camp Grant. But then on top of it, Camp Grant had its own newspaper where they were reporting on what was going on with the war, what was going on at the camp, as well as what was going on locally or personally with the soldiers that were stationed at the camp or at the base. Here's an example. The Camp Dodger, which is Camp Dodge in Iowa, was reporting on what was going on with their units that were stationed there. I had a soldier who was in the 313th Engineers, so I can look through the columns when they're talking about the 313th and find out what was going on with that particular unit. My soldier was in Company A, what was going on with Company A. But then every single one of these camp newspapers had a section about what was going on back home. You know, Bob Jones is on leave for the weekend. His wife just had a baby. Or, these 4 men from the 111th Army Train Unit are being transferred to another unit. It's telling me information about that unit. They're talking about what's going on during the war, especially at this time. They're talking about what's going on with the first pandemic, and they're listing soldiers and sailors who are succumbing to the illness or, who have been hospitalized. So there's a lot of information on the local level, on the city level closest to the camp, and at the camp itself. So keep in mind, newspapers are another one of those resources where you've got multiple levels to that search strategy. Library of Congress is the People's Library. It is a public library that is accessible to any citizen within the United States. And I think we have a tendency to forget and think that it's so big that there's no way they would have any information about my individual ancestor or my veteran. It's absolutely 100% not true. You would be astounded to find out how many local history, local collections that they have, whether it's county histories, whether it's local newspapers, whether it's Sanborn map collections or county plat maps. They've got all kinds of information on regular, ordinary, everyday citizens, just like us. One of those would be the Veterans Oral History Project. So you'll find a lot of really good, useful information. You can even search by unit. You could search by military engagement. You can search by whether they were a civilian or whether they were in the military. So there's a lot of like first-person Holocaust accounts that are in here. They never served in the military, but they're included because they were impacted by the war. So there's a lot of things that could be found about your ancestor, your veteran, even if they never submitted a Veterans Oral History Project themselves. Chronicling America, which is newspapers, like I was talking about the value of newspapers. I believe Chronicling America also has some of those camp and base newspapers in there as well. I know Great Lakes Naval Base is already digitized and available online for free, so you have access to those. You have access to their map collections. So when we talk about military engagements at home, when we're talking about Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War, Spanish-American War, Mexican War, all of those things are going to have maps associated with them, and you're going to find a lot of those available for free through the Library of Congress. So don't pass up the opportunity to look for these maps so you can visually see what was going on. How close were troops to the family farm? If I had a person who was in the Navy, are there ship slains? Are there passenger ships that might have been impacted, all of these different aspects and nuances to the military battle that could be beneficial to you as a family historian. Plus, I also have cheat sheets available for you. So if I want to know more about the Revolutionary War, World War II, the Spanish-American Philippine War, there are going to be cheat sheets for me to download to teach me about the war itself, and then give me some ideas of where to go and what types of records might exist. I just give you a couple of them here, but whatever the military engagement happens to be, they've got one of these military topics pages available for you. So don't overlook Library of Congress. I think there's a lot of things that are available through them that can kind of fill in the gaps in your research. They have a huge collection of photographs, and a lot of those military unit photographs, you know, those 9 by 3 foot photos of the entire unit. They have thousands of these, and some of them are digitized and available online. But if you go to the Library of Congress, all of them are available from the photographs collection in person. So you would be able to bring a zip drive, you know, bring an external drive, bring a USB, you'd be able to download all of these photos directly to your device. So they've got a lot online, not everything. You might still have to, you know, be boots on the ground research, but you will definitely walk away with something. Same thing with the National Archives. National Archives also works like a dartboard. You have several different types of record collections and purposes. So you've got Archives 1, which is where the Constitution and the Declaration are, which is the National Archives 1 in Washington, D.C. They have military records from the American Revolution up to 1914. It gets a little tricky because if you're like me and my Angus was chasing Pancho Villa on the border, nobody can find his records. They're not in Archives 1. They're not in St. Louis where they said they were supposed to be. So there's like this weird 2-year gap where records are kind of missing. But you can go in and request Civil War records. You can request Revolutionary War records. You can request colonial records, Philip's War and 7 Years War and things like that. If they were Buffalo Soldiers or if they fought in the Indian Wars, all of these records are in DC. They also have records, modern records from 1914 forwards for military units that remained stateside. So I have somebody who's at Camp Dodge or at Fort Dix or at, you know, Fort Benning. Those records are in Washington, D.C. Once that unit goes overseas, if it's the AEF and it's the American Expeditionary Unit, or if it's World War II and they were in a military theater in Europe or the Pacific, those unit records are then in College Park at Archives 2 in Maryland. If you're looking for soldier records, sailor records, individual OMPFs, official military personnel files, those are what Tom was talking about, where they said they were fire records. Those records are in St. Louis. So if I need a copy of my Grandpa Casey's record, he was in the Navy in the Second World War. Those records are in St. Louis. But they also have civilian service records there as well. So my Grandpa Casey's wife, my Grandma Jean, worked for Army purchasing at Navy Pier during the Second World War. Her personnel file is there as well, because she worked in a civilian capacity for the military. So her records are there as well. It was kind of fun to see her typing scores and things like that. Those records are in St. Louis. What's at the regional archives, so whether it's Chicago or Denver or Atlanta, are records about the bases and the camps. Now, this is the day-to-day operations of the base and camps. No units, no individual soldiers. This is guardhouse records, who's coming and going at the gate. It's air temps, water temps. If anything happens, like I have one set of records where somebody went AWOL and escaped in the middle of a tornado. Those are the types of records that are there. Records for employees. So whether you're working in food service or you're, you know, cleaning up, you're a cleaning crew, or you're a hospital nurse. Those are the types of records that are at the National Regional Archives. So for example, in Chicago, our regional archive covers 7 different states. So it would include military bases or camps in Illinois, in Indiana, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, Minnesota. I'm drawing a blank on the last one. Maybe it's Iowa. Those records would be there. So if it's Camp Butler in central Illinois, wherever it happens to be, those are where those records are going to live. So again, just like everything else, it's not just I'm stopping one place and I'm getting everything I need. And then to make it even more complicated for you, if you're looking for hospital records, those records are in Kansas City. Hospital records for those who went overseas, like what I was talking about, those are in College Park, Maryland. So that's First, Second World War. Somebody's at a base hospital or a triage hospital overseas, they're in Maryland. But if they're in a hospital in the US, those records are in Kansas City. So with the National Archives, there are forms that you can fill out directly on their website. Excuse me. And you could also apply for records online as well using the eVetRecs, the Electronic Veterans Records link that's on the National Archives page. In your handout, you have access to all of these links. You don't have to click, you don't have to worry about copying down these forms now. But it's an avenue of research if you want to submit a paper request or if you want to contact them electronically for more information on your Revolutionary War soldier or your World War II sailor. You can easily fill out these forms and submit them to them. So now that I've talked about kind of where and how records are created and where they live, let's talk about individual types of military records and where you can find them. So we're going to kind of step through history. We're going to go from Revolutionary War moving forward and some ideas and places to look for records that could be pertinent to this particular military engagement. So for example, if you've never used Cindy's List before, it's a portal. It's an aggregator. What it does is it collects web links by topic or by location to allow you to then dig deeper into a particular topic. So whether it's the Revolutionary War, whether it's Masonic Lodge records, whether it's immigration records, it gives you links and resources for you to continue your research. And she has some really, really good military resources available on her website. Revolutionary War is just the one that I'm highlighting at the moment, but she acts as a portal to put you in contact with original websites. So she's connecting you to those links. So if you haven't looked at Cindy's List for military records, I recommend it. The DAR, first and foremost, is the premier site where you're going to find information on your patriot. But it's not the only one. But it's definitely one, even if you don't have a soldier or sailor who had fought in the Revolutionary War, the Daughters of the American Revolution is a fantastic site for finding those people who disappear before the first ever named census in 1850, especially women, because so many people applied to join the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. And in order to join, you had to supply a family tree. I can find a lot of those people that just disappear because somebody had them in their family and somebody attached them to a tree to a patriot. So even if they never served, even if I'm looking for a War of 1812 veteran or I'm looking for a Spanish-American war soldier, if somehow they're in a family that tracks back to the Revolutionary War, I can use the DAR's website to find them. So it's a really, really good resource just for searching for people in general, even if they didn't serve, mostly for that pre-1850 era, but definitely coming forwards as people are filling out their paperwork and submitting their family trees. Family Search, now that they have digitized all of their microfilm and made them available on the website, it's a little bit more complicated to weed out some of these military records. What I've discovered is that they're slowly taking away microfilm numbers when you're looking at the records, and it's just giving you the digital file folder that it's in. It's getting a little bit more complicated, but Family Search is a really, really good resource for finding this information. Not only do they have the Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrant applications, which are available in multiple sources, the wiki also, if you go and look at the Revolutionary War records, if you look for the wiki page for this, there's lots and lots of links to take you to other sources. And what I love most about Family Search's wiki is that it's not just Family Search resources. If something's available at MyHeritage, or if something is available at Ancestry, or if something is available on the local level, they give you the link to that site. They just want to put the information in your hands. It doesn't have to be just information that comes from them, which is vastly different than other genealogical websites. So the wiki, specifically, if I'm looking for military information, can really lead me to exactly what I'm looking for. I mentioned the state level. You definitely don't want to forget that. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of state databases that were put together. Kentucky has one for Revolutionary War warrants. Tennessee has one as well, which is on the next slide. So these states put together these inventories of people who were returning their warrants based on their military service. Those of us who have been doing this long enough realize that the person who turns in the warrant isn't necessarily the soldier who served. They could have sold it, they could have traded it, they could have donated it to a lovely lady that they had met the night before. All kinds of reasons why the warrant wouldn't necessarily be the soldier themselves. Some of these databases have digitized and scanned the original warrants. Tennessee is one of those where I can see the front and the backside. The backside is the person who signs it to cash it in. Always look to see who's the actual person that was cashing it in. But them, like I said, Tennessee is another really good site where they put together like maps of people who were traveling with land bounty warrants into Tennessee to redeem them. Some really good sites. Ohio is another really good one for military records as well. There's a lot of unit records that exist out there. One of them is Valley Forge. It's the muster roll for those who are with General Washington overwintering before moving on into New Jersey. Really, really good website, a good representative of the types of information that you can find. But then, don't overlook commercial sites as well. So Heritage Quest is one you have access to through Algonquin Library. Fold 3 is another one, which is going to play heavily in the next few military engagements. Is another great resource that you have access to through the Algonquin Library. And what Heritage Quest has is the American Revolutionary War pension files. It's a good collection, but it's an incomplete collection. So because you have access to Fold 3, I would say check Heritage Quest, see what's out there, but then go to Fold 3 and look at the exact same collection that's available through Fold 3. And the reason I say that is because when Heritage Quest digitized these records, they only digitized the pages that were pertinent to the war experience and not the entire file. And they did them in black and white. And colonial handwriting scanned as black and white is notoriously hard to read. When Fold 3 digitized the same collection, they scan them in grayscale, so they're crisp and clear and easy to read, and they included the entire file. So for example, we have a patriot in Plainfield, Jeremiah Austin, who had passed away and was buried in Plainfield in 1836. Heritage Quest has his file. It's 9 pages long. It includes a copy of his last will and testament. It includes a copy of his service statement. Exact same file available through Fold 3 is 62 pages long. I get 9 out of Heritage Quest. I get 62 out of Fold 3 because all of the ladies in the family who applied for the DAR and wrote letters to the National Archives asking to verify his service, 1933, 1971, all of those files are included in the Fold 3 copy. They're not included in the Heritage Quest copy. So if you've used Heritage Quest before to look for these files, definitely make sure you go into Fold 3 to look at the exact same collection. So Fold 3, as I mentioned, not only do they have that pension file collection, but they also have Revolutionary War service records. They're not very detailed. They're really just kind of the monthly submission card that was submitted to verify that they were there or that they were not. Not a lot of information, but at least it verifies they were in a unit. Anybody who was arrested and imprisoned, those records are available through the Revolutionary War. So those sailors, especially that got captured, this is true for the War of 1812 as well. So for those, as the UK called them, pirates who were commandeering British vessels, if they were caught and imprisoned, they'll show up in this card file that Fold 3 has digitized. And then those final payment vouchers. So in In the email from Anne, there were two handouts. There was a handout with the websites I was talking about tonight, but then there was also a resource guide that I included for you. And in that resource guide, it talks a little bit about Revolutionary War records. And one thing I want you to be aware of is that there was a fire in 1800 that destroyed Revolutionary War pension files. So what you find online, what you find in these collections at Fold 3 and at Heritage Quest and at the National Archives are after 1800. So if you had a soldier that had petitioned and had received a pension or had received land as part of their war service before 1800, unless that soldier or family member was still alive to resubmit it to the National Archives, or was recreated in some way, you're looking at records that are post 1800. So just be aware sometimes if you know you had a family member who served because family legend and personal memorabilia proves that they served, but you can't find anything, then you would ask yourself the question, did they die before 1800? And could those records have been a casualty of that fire for the War Department? Ancestry is not my favorite place to go for Revolutionary War records. They've got a lot of indexes, they've got a lot of abstracts of records, but you're not really looking at a lot of original records. I'm going to go to Fold 3 or I'm going to go to Heritage Quest if I want to see the original record. But it's definitely, again, I'm going to check it just because I know I'm doing research on this particular military engagement. So not only did I mention I can use the DAR website in order to track my patriots and those descendants of those patriots, but if you've ever had the chance to go to the DAR library, it is really absolutely worth it for any genealogist. Even if you're not trying to become a member, you could pay a small fee, you can get into the library and you can utilize their collections because they really focused on having genealogical records across all 50 states. So not only do they have a lot of military service books and histories and information, they've got a lot of that local county and state information I was talking about as well. So those cemetery inventories, those inventories of soldiers, the county courthouse records that somebody's indexed and abstracted, old land records. They have a lot of genealogy that's available to you. You can always reach out to them and ask them to look for particular records or particular files for you. So keep that in mind too. If you have the ability to go to DC and you have the ability to use the library, it will not be a waste of your time. So now War of 1812, I do have a Revolutionary War patriot. I do have a War of 1812 patriot in my family as well. So the War of 1812 records really live on Fold 3. That is the strongest collection of 1812 records that are out there. These are records that were digitized by FGS, by the Federation of Genealogical Societies. They took on this task and worked with state organizations like Illinois State Genealogical Society to get these records not only digitized, but then indexed and transcribed as well. These are a collection that will always be free on Fold 3. That was the one thing that FGS insisted. So even if you don't have a subscription to Fold 3, you still have access to War of 1812 records, even without a subscription to it because of FGS's contract with them. So you can see they've got the pension files. They've got these prize claims that I talked about. So these ships that were captured by US sailors that were taken away from the British, those are listed in here. So what the names of the soldiers and the sailors were who might have been captured on board those British ships, as well as all of the goods and supplies that were taken as well. Those are really cool to look at. They've got the service records. They've got pension files. There's a lot of things in there that would benefit you. I do not like the Ancestry Library Edition collections for War of 1812. And the reason being is because the pension application files and the soldier indexes are done by the captain of the unit. So if you have absolutely no clue that Captain Chestnut was the person who was the captain of John McClure's unit, you're going to struggle to find them. So as a last ditch effort, I might look in Ancestry in their War of 1812 records, but I'm truly going to go to Fold 3 first and foremost. Then I might look for additional records through other sources. Internet Archive also has a copy of the pension list for the War of 1812. This was a record collection that was done in the 19th century for soldiers who were still living and were collecting pensions. So when I look at Ancestry, their collection was done in the 20th century. It was done in the 1950s, referencing back to War of 1812 records. This 6-volume set of pension lists that are available through Internet Archive for free. I would go in and I would download the volume for the state you're looking for. It's arranged by county. So if you know what county they were living in 1838, you can look and see if they were claiming pension files, and then look, contact the National Archives for a copy of that record. But this one is very close to the war and is pretty accurate compared to some of the other databases that were done later in the 20th century. National Archives has a lot of records. They have been working night and day, them and the Library of Congress, since the start of COVID, to digitize original records and make them available online. So you are finding a lot of military service records and unit records starting to pop up directly in the National Archives catalog. So if you haven't looked at the National Archives catalog in a while, definitely go out to archives.gov and take a look and see what's new, because you might find records there for your veteran ancestor that were not available online before COVID. They really worked hard to get these available. Access Genealogy is a really interesting site. They're not great for all things, but they do have a nice military collection. So you can go out and take a look at their 1812 indexes. And then military indexes is really cool too, because it includes things like state censuses and local censuses that were done for military service to find veterans and document pensions. So military indexes is a good source to just search to see if your ancestors listed. They helped me find one of my Spanish-American War veterans using one of their indexes for the Spanish-American War. So sometimes you find things in the most unique places. Again, I've mentioned Family Search. Definitely take a look at their wiki for the types of 1812 records that are available. So now the Black Hawk War is very unique to us. So Black Hawk War really only involved Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Black Hawk War was very short-lived. It was about 9 months. And what it was individual state militias being called up to fight against Black Hawk. The reason being is they wanted the Potawatomi and the other tribes to move west of the Mississippi River. Some of them didn't want to go. Some of them decided to fight back. So our local units were called up in order to combat this enemy that they deemed to be an enemy. So you're going to find these records on the state level. And specifically for Illinois, if you go to the Secretary of State's website, they've got a series of books that have rosters of Black Hawk War units and members. So you can go and take a look at that and see if you might have had any soldier who had served in that. Like I said, it was very short-lived. There's not a lot of documentation through federal resources. National Archives does have a page that talks about the significance of the Black Hawk War and the few records that they have available to them. But largely you're going to be looking statewide for these. You're going to be looking at the state of Wisconsin, the state of Indiana, the state of Illinois, for any and all information pertaining to Black Hawk War veterans and soldiers. Same is going to be true largely when you talk about the Mexican War. It really affected, 5 states particularly. Illinois did have some units from Southern Illinois that did go down to fight in the Mexican War. Fold 3 has a small collection that are available on their website. Last I heard, this was the collection that FGS was going to pick up and do as their next big project before they were rolled into the National Genealogical Society. So there's some information available on that through Fold 3. But then, like I said, I forgot to change my link. CyberDrive Illinois still works. I missed one. You caught me. You could still get there through CyberDrive, or you can go to the ilsos.gov link to get to Mexican War service members who had served from Illinois. Again, Family Search has a good collection. And then there's a link, the Descendants of Mexican War Veterans, which has some good information, not only about those who had served, but about what happened to them after. Where are they buried? You know, did they happen to join any other type of service organization after the fact? So it's a really good source for finding what happened next. Civil War is probably the largest amount of information that we have accessible to us to military veterans, even larger than what's available for American Revolutionary War soldiers and sailors. There are multiple places, avenues for you to do Civil War research. National Park Service, if you have not taken advantage of the National Park Service, by all means, you need to. So not only do they have a database of soldiers and sailors, but each of the national parks that are associated with a Civil War battlefield has its own archives. It has its own museum. And in that museum and in those archives are first-person accounts and documents that were donated from families who had soldiers or sailors who had served that have donated those back to them. They're not at the National Archives. They're not in the Smithsonian. They're at that particular site, whether it's Fort Pulaski, whether it's Gettysburg, whether it's Vicksburg. They have original documentation. So if you have somebody who fought at the Battle of Williamsburg, for example, you definitely want to reach out to the National Park Service and ask them, what kind of records do they have? Do they have any types of illustrations? Do they have any types of photographs after the battle? Do they have any type of anniversary pamphlets or booklets or brochures about returning soldiers for 25th anniversaries, 50th anniversaries, and photos of those events that you might be able to access? So do not skip the National Park Service. They're a very important and vital part of your Civil War research. And this is true for other military engagements that the National Park Service monitors, whether it's Bunker Hill or another site. Fort Sumter would be another good example. You definitely want to make sure that you're asking them what types of records they have that could potentially list your soldier or sailor. Fold 3 has an enormous collection of Civil War records that are available online. Not only are they working on digitizing the widow's pensions files, they're nowhere near being done. It's going to take years for this collection to be finished because it is so massive. But you also have access to the Civil War Soldier Service records, which are done, which you have access to. Southern Claims Commissions are some of my favorite record groups to look through. Excuse me. If you've ever heard Deb Dudak and I do our presentation on Civil War research, she puts on her best Scarlett O'Hara voice and reads some of these pension files, you know, where she's like, they burned down my farm. They stole all my horses. Anybody who had a claim against the federal government in the South, the U.S. government in the South, reached out to the Southern Claims Commission and filed a complaint or a report. 60% of those claims were rejected. And the reason being is because you had to have not raised arms against the U.S. government, meaning you couldn't be a Confederate. You could not be a Confederate soldier or sailor. You could not have a husband or a child or a brother who was a Confederate soldier. So a lot of these applications were rejected because, well, you said you had nobody in your family who served in the Confederacy, but yet 6 of your sons did. How about that? Rejected. And a lot of them were claims that couldn't be verified. And in those that are rejected, it'll say something like the U.S. Army wasn't within 100 miles of this farm. There's absolutely no way that the U.S. Army could have stolen their horses or taken their wheat. Of the 40% of those that were approved, then you have access to those through Fold 3. The rejected claims are at the National Archives, and you would have access to them there. What you're looking at in Fold 3 Southern Claims Commission reports are those that were approved, a very tiny portion of those that are approved. But go in, even if you didn't have somebody who filed one, and just read some of them. I hate to say it, but they're tremendously entertaining. I mean, because you want to make it sound terrible. So you're going to like throw it all in there so that you can get money back from the US government. So, I mean, some of the claims are pretty fantastical. Other free collections that are available to you are the Matthew Brady Civil War photos and the Abraham Lincoln assassination papers. Those records are available to you. You don't have to have a subscription to gain access to those. But one thing I want you to keep in mind too is these records were collections that were within the National Archives. So you'll find Confederate amnesty papers and Confederate renouncing Confederate citizenship files in here, but you're not going to find Confederate soldiers and sailors records here because they were no longer US citizens. As soon as they seceded and as soon as they joined the Confederate military, they were no longer US citizens. So those records are not available through the National Archives. You have to go through the individual states where those soldiers might have served to gain access to any pension or any type of claim that they had through their individual state. So in your resource guide, I give you a whole bunch of those web links that are available to you. So whether or not it's somebody from Florida, Arizona even had some Confederate units that were in Arizona at the time, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. You've got links to those in your collection. But what's in the amnesty papers are people who, if they wanted to become a US citizen again so that they could vote and so that they could do other things, they had to, renounce allegiance to the CSA, and they had to promise that they would never raise arms again against the US government. So a very tiny portion of Southern men who had served in the Confederacy actually did this. A lot of them never acknowledged the fact and never became US citizens again. So they never had the right to vote. They never had, the right for pension, for any of that. They had to go straight to their state for any of that type of information. So you have to keep in mind how and why records are collected. And this is an important point, that you're not going to find Southern records in these collections. Ancestry has some collections as well. Again, just abstracts and indexes. I'm not looking at original records, but in Fold 3 I am. Other places to look. So Freedmen's Bank records, if you had somebody who was in, the reconstructed South after the Civil War, excuse me, I have the hiccups now, then you would be able to look in the Freedmen's Bank records to find out additional information about them. So not only are we dealing with freed slaves who are now applying for bank accounts because they're gainfully employed and they're making money, but it would include their friends and their neighbors and their current employers who are verifying, yes, they are who they say they are. Yes, these are their children, or yes, these are their parents. So there's a lot of neighborhood involved. There's a lot of local people who are involved in these types of records as well. So it's worth looking at if you have family in the South, because you just might come across a family member mentioning, being signing an affidavit for a friend, verifying that they are the person that they say they are. Like I said, the records of the claims committees, those ones that were rejected and were not approved, are available through the National Archives. So if you want to see if a claim was filed but was rejected, here's the link that'll get you into that collection to take a look. Family Tree magazine has a really nice article that they wrote about where to look for Civil War records. So if I'm looking for those kind of smaller state or municipal records dealing with Civil War, they give a nice overview on where to look for those. Again, Sons of Union Veterans, Grand Army of the Republic, those are Northern, those are US types records. If I'm looking for things like Sons of the Confederacy, then I'm going to be looking for those records in individual states in the South. Virginia Tech University has a really fascinating newspaper collection, largely for Virginia, but for some other states as well. Really gives you a completely opposite and different view of the Civil War from a Southern perspective. It's definitely interesting to go in and read the after action articles that they're writing about these battles, to see what their opinion, what their view, how they're spinning what's happening in the war in Southern newspapers. And some of the South, while obviously you would think it was Confederate leaning, has an entire run of Harper's Weekly, which was a Northern newspaper magazine. So all kinds of information available on military battles and engagements. They had artists who traveled with the units and sketched the scenes, because you couldn't take photos at that time. You couldn't get a shot to be long enough without it being blurry. So they actually had embedded reporters. The people think that the Associated Press is a new thing. They've had embedded reporters. The AP has been around since the 1850s. So there were a lot of people who were traveling around during the war, writing about what was happening. And all of these are available for free through Son of the South. You've got a full run of Harper's Weekly in there. Spanish-American War, if you're like me and my Uncle Gus, my great Uncle Gus had served. Spanish-American War kind of lumps two wars together. Technically, it would be the Philippine-American War and the Spanish-American War, but for ease of use, even the National Archives refers to them as the Spanish-American War. It includes all of it together under one umbrella. My great Uncle Gus served in the Philippines. So technically, his records are Philippine-American War, but they're all lumped together at the National Archives under the same header. So how was I able to find my great Uncle Gus and find out where he was buried? Sons of the Spanish-American War had a fantastic website put together that showed the burials, the final resting places of as many Spanish-American War veterans as they could. So while I knew that he had served and I knew that he had moved to Missouri, I had no idea where he was buried. And I found out that he was buried in Poplar Bluff Cemetery, tiny little town in southern Missouri. So I was able to go there and actually take a photograph of his headstone. And all of it was based on the information I found from this website. His name was August Schaefer, spelled several different ways, and there was probably a dozen different August Schaefers who had served in the Spanish-American War. So looking at the Spanish-American War links that were available through the National Archives, Ancestry wasn't really providing me with the information I was seeking. Sons of the Spanish-American War nailed it. It was exactly what I needed to find. The Navy, so if you're looking for things on like the battleship Maine, or you want to know more about the naval history of the Spanish-American War, the Navy has its own military historian. The link is included in here for you to talk about the naval aspect of the Spanish-American War as well. Now, what about people who did not serve in any official military engagement? Those people who served in between, who might have just signed up and joined and volunteered in the Army or the Navy, but never saw any type of action. Those records are at the National Archives 1 in Washington, D.C. So as you can see from this, if you want to screenshot it, be my guest, you are welcome to. But it shows you those places where it's not technically any type of war. It's not an official military engagement, but people still served in those time periods. And these are the types of records and the date ranges that they have. So I'll pause for a second if anybody wants to do a screenshot of it. But you're definitely going to reach out to Archives 1 in DC for these types of records. World War I, here's my Angus. Isn't he handsome? So Angus had served in the First World War. He had been stationed overseas in France with the 4th CAC, which is the Coastal Artillery Unit. Why would a coastal artillery unit be in central France? But he was. So I was able to track down military records for Angus in all of those archives that I talked about. I was able to get a copy of his burned military file from St. Louis. I was able to go to College Park, Maryland, and look at original unit records for him overseas in France. So I was able to find him being promoted from supply sergeant to sergeant. And then I was able to find him in records in Archives 1 once he was stateside. So I was able to find him going through Camp Grant at his discharge and additional information about him being sent back to Illinois. So different levels. Sadly, World War I and Korea have always kind of been referred to as the forgotten war. And World War I definitely lives up to that claim. Because when you think about military engagements, and attention that's paid, it's usually 25th anniversary, 50th anniversary, 75th anniversary, where they're getting the attention and people are really going back and looking at these records and studying what might have happened. But for the First World War, the 25th anniversary is right smack in the middle of World War II. Vietnam War is right smack in the middle of the 50th anniversary for that. And then the Gulf War for the 75th anniversary. So it never really got the attention that it deserved. And because of that, even now with the centennial, with the 100th anniversary of the war, before COVID, you can't even use COVID as an excuse. Before COVID, the US government never put the time and the energy into digitize and make available First World War records. And it's really a shame because the UK, France, Australia, Canada, all of these places that fought alongside the US, who were there longer, digitize their soldiers and sailors records, had these records collections up and available online. The US never did it, and they still haven't done it. So we get a tiny fraction of First World War records that are available that pertain to US troops, to US soldiers, sailors, and nurses. So the World War I draft card file is available pretty much everywhere. I just house it here under Ancestry. But the problem with First World War draft cards is it doesn't include the men who enlisted the first 4 months of the war. So the first draft is done in June of 1917. The war begins April 16th. Between April and June, all those hundreds of thousands of men who had joined the military aren't represented in draft cards because they're already serving. So there's a big gap there. And the people that you're seeing in the draft cards, a lot of them never served. So it's a bit of a misnomer that they had to register, but never actually served in the military. The one shining light in all of this is the U.S. Army Transport Service records. So this includes information on the men and women who went overseas to France or went to the Canal Zone. Lots of units went to the Canal Zone and were stationed in the Canal Zone during the war. Angus's cousin, John, was one of those, never went to France. His unit was sent to the Canal Zone. This is where I can find them coming and going. There's two sets of records. There's the ship's manifest of them leaving the US to go to France. And then there's the ship's manifest of them getting on board in France and coming back to the US. You have to look at both sets of records because the unit that they went to France might not be the unit in which they returned. And if you see them listed as returning with a casual unit, that doesn't mean that they were civilians now. What it means is they were wounded and they returned to the US outside of their official unit. So Angus, who was a member of the 46 CAC, comes back in a casual unit because he had been gassed during the war. So he's going out with one unit, he's returning with another. And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. The other beauty of this is it gives the next of kin in case the ship sinks. So his mother, Marion, is listed on both records as who to contact in case the ship goes down. And it gives me a service number. So if I want to request this record, finding him in the transport service records gives me the service number so that I can request his file from the National Archives in St. Louis. So really the best record group that you can find for First World War service. But the downside is if your soldier or sailor or nurse stayed stateside, there's very little representation online to help you find those records for those people who remain stateside, unfortunately. Fold 3 is a really good collection of those who naturalized because of their First World War service. So for example, if you were drafted and you were not a US citizen, they gave you the choice, sort of. You can either become a US citizen or you could be dishonorably discharged from the US military and potentially sent home. Those records exist at the National Archives 1 in Washington, D.C. So they asked everybody in every unit, do you want to become a U.S. citizen? And if you said yes, your application was fast-tracked, and those show up in Fold 3. If you said no, then you were deposed. They recorded an interview with all of your answers, and then they discharged you from the military. And potentially, if you didn't answer the questions correctly, they started deportation proceedings against you as well. So if you had somebody who did not naturalize, I don't want to become a US citizen. I'm Greek and I want to go back to Greece when the war is over, or I'm a Mexican citizen. I want to return home when this is over. All of those records exist at Archives 1 in DC, and they're arranged by camp. So if you were at Camp Dodge, all of those would be by numerical by unit, so 111th, 313th, and you'd be able to look at the original records. They're not digitized yet, but they do exist out there. They also have those panoramic unit photos that I was talking about, like the Library of Congress has. You would be able to see some of those on Fold 3. So if you know the unit, you could do a search and see if those come up. Other cool records that exist out there, the Polar Bear expedition were those US troops who were trapped in Russia after the collapse of the Tsar and were being held kind of prisoners of war by Soviet troops. Those records are available through the University of Michigan because the vast majority of those men who were in that expedition were from Michigan militia units. We're from Michigan National Guard units. So University of Michigan has a fantastic record collection about that. So if you had somebody involved in that, this is your first and foremost place where you're going to go to look for that. A lot of U.S. troops worked alongside other nationalities. So there's a lot of records pertaining to U.S. soldiers who were fighting alongside Canadians in both Canadian archives, Australian archives. For Black units, like the 368th, the 369th here from Chicago. There's a lot of information about them in French archives because they were put under the wing of French units. So there's a lot of overlap in those. If you had a soldier who didn't survive or a nurse who didn't survive and is buried overseas, American Battle Monuments Commission has military information, headstone information for First and Second World War. You're welcome to take a look at that. Like I said, British Library has a lot of information. Flanders Field Museum Project for those who were killed in action is available. Europeana is a great resource for those who might have had family members who served from one of the allies, whether it was French or whether it was British. They've got records in there as well. National World War I Museum in Kansas City. If you've ever had the chance to go, it is absolutely breathtaking. It is listed as one of the top 10 museums in the country, and they have earned it. It is an absolute fantastic resource. They have an archives in the library as well. If you find something on their collection that's referenced in the catalog, but there's no digital image, if you contact them, they will scan it and make it available for you for free. They want to make sure these records are getting in the hands of the family members of those who served. So if you find something on their site in their archives collection or on their library page, definitely reach out to them. They will be more than happy to scan it. So those camp newspapers that I was talking about, they have a full run of camp newspapers. They've got a lot of first-person diaries. They've got a lot of personal accounts that if you find a reference to it, you can ask for it. Now for the Second World War, as we start to get into modern military records, we start to see less and less available online. And the reason being is because it's still within the average life expectancy of records collections for the National Archives. So the National Archives works on a 62-year rolling schedule. So records become available 62 years from today's date. So let that sink in for a second. You know, we're talking about 1961 here. You know, we're not talking about records that are super far back. So each day that rolls by, 62 years, those records are available through the National Archives system, especially St. Louis. So because of that, if somebody was still alive after 1962, after 1961, those records aren't available yet. So you're going to have to wait and bide your time until they start to become available. So what you're going to find for World War II, Korea, Vietnam, you're going to find casualty lists. You're going to find things like missing crew reports. You're going to find naval ship registers. You're going to find things like court martials and FBI files. You're not going to find original military personnel files. So JAG case files would be, you know, you went AWOL for a week and you were brought up on charges. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be in there. The rolls of honor are actually useful, but they don't give you any information. They just confirm whether or not somebody was in the military. They're just large volumes of books listing people alphabetically by surname. So there's not a lot of information you get out of it, but at least it can confirm whether or not you had a family member who served. And when you see casualty reports, I want you to keep in mind that to civilians, casualties mean death. If you're in the military, casualties mean death, injury, or illness. So if there's a casualty list for the Vietnam War, excuse me, or the Korean War, World War II, look at it, because they could have had German measles. They could have been wounded by shrapnel. A Band-Aid was slapped on them and they were sent back to the front. That still shows up in these records as a casualty. So you have to make sure that you're looking at these. I'll tell you a very quick story. When I was in college, I took a history of the Second World War class with my professor, Dr. Earl Whitehan. And he was an adorable little man that always wore sandals and had the world's ugliest feet. As I digress, Dr. Whitehan had served and was at the Battle of Anzio Beach. in Italy. And he tells the story about how you could tell how close the artillery shells were by how high pitched the whistle of it was as it was coming in. And he tells the story about how one day this had such a high pitched whistle, he was like, that one's got my number on it. And when it came down and exploded, it wound up hitting him with shrapnel right in the derriere. So he thought, I've got the $1 million wound. I've got shrapnel in my behind. They're going to send me home. He says all they did was pull out the shrapnel, stab a Band-Aid on him, slap him in the butt and tell him to get back to work. So his idea of being able to go home was kind of, literally blown up when he was told to get back to the front. He got a Purple Heart for it because he was wounded, and he shows up in the casualty list if you search for him, but he was not killed in action. So Mr. Kesich, the very first veterans oral history I did, had caught the German measles. There was a terrible outbreak of German measles in base camps here in the States. He shows up in the casualty list because he was in the hospital for 3 weeks recovering from German measles. So you'll find all kinds of reasons why people might show up in there. World's Vital Records, which doesn't exist anymore, but it's been rolled into MyHeritage. You're still going to find these same collections available to you in there. So they've got Reserve Corps records, not a whole lot. They're not really very detailed. They're mostly just indexes of units as well. So you have access to those types of things too. Do not overlook the Second World War Museum in New Orleans. It is definitely an amazing resource with a lot of first-person information associated to it, lots of letters, lots of diaries. It's definitely worth taking the time to see what they've got on their website. If you happen to have family members who had been impacted by the Holocaust, the International Tracing Service, Yad Vashem would probably be the two places I would look first for information. Fold 3 has a collection, but it's not as personal. It's not as big. It doesn't have as much information in it as these two particularly do. Same thing with the United States Holocaust Museum. Does have some good information, but isn't really complete. I would definitely take a look there. The Weiner Holocaust Library is the first and foremost premier library when it comes to Holocaust history. Weiner himself had started collecting information on what was going on with Hitler and the oppression of Jews as early as 1936. So it's some of the earliest records that were kind of smuggled out of Germany and Eastern Europe and just expanded in the decades following the end of the war. So they have a really, really, really large collection of information about Jewry in Europe, as well as displaced persons camps, and all kinds of information about Holocaust victims as well as Holocaust survivors. So even though it's overseas in London, it is really a fantastic resource, and I highly recommend reaching out to them and checking their website. Korean War, like I said, some records available, but not a whole lot of information. Just like with Second World War, you have access to Stars and Stripes newspaper. You're getting the US edition. Every location where there were US troops stationed, there was an edition. There was a European theater edition, a South Pacific edition, and a US edition. What you're seeing on Ancestry is the US edition. You could see that goes through the start of the Vietnam War. Again, those casualty lists are listed there. Those who were killed and interred overseas are going to be available there, as well as ABMC, the American Battle Monuments Commission. Fold 3 has a little bit more information about those naval cruise books, which go back to 1946. So if you had somebody who was in the Navy, they're basically like yearbooks. They have a snapshot of them in their uniform, and then information about what was going on board ship for that year. That has some good information. The headstone application files available through Fold 3 are really good, but they only go up to 1956. So if you had somebody who died after that, those records are on index cards at the National Archives 1 in Washington, D.C. So they do still exist. You're only seeing what's online, though, up into 1956. So keep that in mind. You're not seeing the full run. Again, MyHeritage, the Army casualties list, and the Air Force registers. And then for Vietnam, really outside of Fold 3, there's not a whole lot out there. The Smithsonian Institute, the link that you had in your handout wasn't active anymore, unfortunately. But here's a new link if you want to take a screenshot of it, if you have any interest in it. at all. You can go out to the Smithsonian Institution libraries to get access to these commission and warrant officer lists for the Navy and the Marines. It's not a full run, but at least it's a good indication of records dealing with the late 1950s into the mid 1960s. So if you had somebody who was a Navy officer, they might show up in these records as well. Most information that's available right now for the Vietnam War is coming from these sons and daughters groups, these people who are creating these websites and these memorial sites for ships and planes and units that are being run by the kids and the grandkids of those who had served in Vietnam. So Facebook is an absolutely great place to look for these. Social media is a good place to look, where they're connecting and talking about what their parents might have done or saw while they were overseas during Vietnam. But these memorial sites are springing up left and right. So doing a search, whether it's on Google or Bing or whatever source you want to look, if you know the unit, if you know the ship that they might have been on, you're probably going to find some of these sites out there. But don't overlook the recent military engagements as well. Like Honor the Fallen is a site that's designed to as a memorial to those who had died in the Iraq wars. So they're 1990s, 2000s military deaths as well. Again, Cindy's list is a good resource. Linkpendium is a good place to check. The Illinois Digital Archives. We've got a lot of records for Illinois soldiers and sailors that are available through IDA, Illinois. So if you haven't thought to look there for it, they also have a lot of newspapers that are digitized and available through IDA as well. So you might be able to find some articles about the unit or the division that they were in, depending on the military engagement that they were part of. Medal of Honor Recipients has its own website. Pritzker Military Library is a lending library. So if you find something within their collection, it can be requested through interlibrary loan. Selective service records are available to be requested if somebody had turned 18 before 1960. So if you had somebody who had to register with selective service when they turned 18 and they turned 18 before 1960, you could fill out a request form and have them send you a copy of it. So that information is available to you for those who you may not have served, but you want to get that personal information off of the card. You can request it from them. And then the VA cemetery database, which lists all of the soldiers who are buried in one of the national cemeteries across the country, like Abraham Lincoln here in Illinois. It's going to give you a roster of soldiers and sailors buried there. So I tried to cover most things, but I know I didn't cover everything. So if you have a specific website that you love that I didn't mention, please be sure to share it. Or if you have a question about military engagement or a type of record I didn't mention, then by all means, let me know. One site that I didn't mention in my handout, but it's definitely worth taking a look at, is Andrew Carroll's website for U.S. soldiers' letters. And I apologize, I don't remember off the top of my head what the link is. I'm going to see if I can find it. I've only glanced at it a couple times. I've never really spent a lot of time investigating it. But he wrote a book on soldiers' letters that he released, I think in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. But he's been amassing this collection of military letters written to and from families. And he donated them to a university. And now I got to look and see what the university
That
is.
sounds awesome. So while you're looking that up, Tina, I'm just going to pop up a really quick poll for everybody who's still on. Just looking to know how many people are watching at your location. If you could quick answer that, we'll just get an accurate count of who's here. Also, just a reminder too, that you'll want to make sure some of the things you mentioned earlier for earlier wars is to check for the headstone gravestone marker applications. Are those available just for like Civil War? Are they available for any of the later wars?
Absolutely, they're available.
Okay.
You just have to show a connection between you and the soldier. They've
Okay.
gotten a little bit more lax on that over the last few years. I know a decade ago, like if you weren't a direct descendant, you couldn't apply for one. So like we tried to do it as the library, as the historical society, they wouldn't let us. We had to find living descendants, and some of them we couldn't. But they really have have released, the burden on having to be a direct descendant.
Right.
So now it's much more open. So it's a little
Okay.
easier.
All right. And then my second comment, not a question, would be to also remember to check your local newspapers if your soldier was mentioned in their local newspaper very, very often. I know I have uncles that there was a lot of information given. I mean, remember back when all your births were announced and everything, all that personal information, there's a lot of information very much like that about our soldiers from our hometown. So don't forget about newspaper research for those later wars.
Absolutely. I mean, they loved
Mhm.
nothing more than, when soldiers got married and they could run it in the newspaper with them
Yeah.
in their uniforms. Oh, you
Mhm.
find all kinds of great
Yeah.
stuff.
They're
Okay, so
great.
I found the link, but it's too long for me to type in. So
Okay.
it's at Chapman University,
Okay.
and it is called the Center for American War Letters. So it'd be worth it to go in and see if your surnames or if any of your families pop up in these collections, because he bought them at flea markets, at antique stores, at garage sales. He just amassed this huge collection and has since donated it.
Chapman, is that
Chapman,
CHAP?
yes,
Chapman
CHAPMAN.
University. Okay.
Yeah, the
Everybody knows
Center
how
for
to use the
American War
Google.
Letters.
We can Google that, right? Everybody can Google that. Okay. Does anybody have a question that you want to type in a chat, or if you want, you can unmute and ask your question. Don't everybody speak up at once? No questions right now.
Hi,
I'll
Tina.
stun everybody silent.
Tom
Yeah.
has a
Hi,
question.
Tina.
Go
Do you
ahead.
hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Tom Bachman. I was the one that talked initially about my grandfather in World War One. I said he took the sidearm of a dead German major. Is there any way, anything that you're aware of, any databases or anything that would possibly list, if I have the dates that Cecil was over there, that would possibly tell what, if a German major was killed?
You probably would want to check through German sources, because just like we
probably
would,
have to be German sources.
I would definitely check German sources. You could probably check, I mean, if you look in US newspapers, you could just put in, German major killed, or, see if anything pops up in that window.
Yeah, I already tried that.
Yeah, German officer, whatever. Not probably online, but in the unit records, there would definitely be information about that. Most likely, it probably would have been recorded if they could verify casualties. There's a thing that they're called war diaries. And war diaries are different than personal diaries. So war diaries were basically a blow-by-blow, play-by-play, day-by-day inventory of what was going on for every unit during the First and Second World War. So the 313th Engineers, the company clerk, think Radar O'Reilly, right? This is an easy way to think of it, would be writing down everything that was going on. Today we did this. Today we had 5 men join, 3 men get discharged. We had 2 men in the hospital, 1 man killed. These are our supplies. This is where we're marching. This is how far we've gone. The water temperature, the air temperature. And day by day, they would be talking about what went on in that particular unit. So since you know the unit, I would do a Google search for, the name of the unit in War Diary. And there are 2 huge collections that are out there. So for the First World War, there's the First World War Museum. Take a look in their archives and see if they have the War Diary for that particular unit. And then the second collection is the oh God, what is it called? The War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So the Army War College has another huge collection of First and Second World War diaries as well. So if you know the name of the unit, it becomes really early.
The Army
in
War
Carlisle,
College.
Pennsylvania.
Carlisle?
Yeah. And another thing to do also is remember each branch of the military has its own historian. So there's the Navy historian, the Army historian, the Marines historian, the Coast Guard historian. You can reach out to the Army historian and say, here's the story. How do I verify what unit or who this officer may have been?
Mhm.
So that's always an option too. And then the Library of Congress and the National Archives both have First World War map collections, although I don't think they're digitized and available online. But the First World War map collection at the National Archives would be showing exactly where troop movements were day by day by day. So since you know the unit, you'd be able to go through these maps and follow the progression to see who was surrounding them and what units were they engaging
Yeah.
against.
Yeah, I've already found
Does that make
some of
sense?
that information, yeah.
Yeah, and if you know the name, if you could figure out the unit, the German unit, I'm just looking for a list of officers and whether or not they were killed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the one battle I found something a German officer, I think it was a German colonel, had written later about the war, and the one battle, he said 8 officers were killed, but he didn't list the officers.
Of course not.
Of course not. I thought, why
Right.
can't you say who they were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Was there another question? I think Karen was getting ready to ask a question. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was late
Hi,
getting
Karen.
here. I
Thanks,
apologize.
Tom. You're fine.
My grandfather was in World War II and he was like a very, very young 18-year-old when he signed up, if that. And I'm just trying to trace him because he originally signed up in Missouri and ended up, as far as I remember, going out through Washington State. And then, but I'm just trying to get an actual, I found the little card when we did one of those genealogy things at
Mhm.
night. So I found the registration card. After that part, I don't know where to go, to track him and see what I can do. Now I know the fire played a huge part in it and he was Army. I was just trying to see what I could do to maybe get that from my aunts, you know what I mean, to see what I could put together for them.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I would say reach out to the county and see if you can get a copy of his discharge papers. So wherever he returned, wherever home was, is where he would have filed his discharge papers. Another thing would be to, again, reach out to VFW or American Legion, because he would have had to, if he had joined, he would have had to have supplied that information, his unit, potentially his service number, to access that records. So when you get a fire record back from the archives, they say there's a little sheet in there that says, tell us everything you know. Well, I knew I wouldn't be asking you. So what they do is they go back, sorry, my cold is
No, that's all
flaring up.
right.
So what they do is they try to recreate that. We could do the same thing. We just have to follow in his footsteps. So if we can find his unit through a VFW card application or through his discharge papers. Now, remember, if he was wounded and was discharged in a discharge detachment unit or in a casual unit, it's not going to help. But at least you would have something. If you've got a service number, then you can request the records from the National Archives. Even if you requested the records 2 years ago or 6 months ago, request them again, because it's a little short now because with COVID, the restoration building has been closed. And I
Yeah.
honestly don't know if they've reopened yet. But if you had requested records a long time ago, request again. Because I've had some records that have been beefed up and more has been added to them since my initial request a decade ago, because they're pulling from other sources. They're pulling from hospital records now. They're pulling from final payment vouchers now. So they're pulling from other sources.
Okay.
Again, newspaper searches, because the newspaper would have loved to brag about
Okay.
soldiers enlisting and soldiers returning home.
Okay.
So they might have listed his unit in the newspaper. If he's buried in the cemetery, see if they wrote that down, because a lot of cemeteries would have a special page just for veterans where they
Okay.
would write that information down if they were entitled to military service.
Mhm.
You could reach out to the VA office. There's a VA office in every county, so you don't have to go to Springfield. You can reach out to the VA office in the county where he might have lived and get a copy of his papers too. So there's other little bits and pieces of that to where you can try to find some more information. It gets harder the more recent you come, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, because there's not as many resources online.
Mhm.
But there are some good places to check where it's really just picking up the phone and making a phone call.
Okay, and then so just a general question. So like, for example, he went through Africa, he went through China. He went all over the place.
Mm.
So would he follow that same unit, or would they change that, or do you have to go through
It
different?
depends.
Okay.
If they had taken on heavy casualties and the unit needed to be reorganized, he might have joined another unit. If he went in as general army, but then learned a specialty skill, where now he was a machine gunner or now he was a tank driver, he might have been moved to an artillery unit or something like that.
Okay.
So there was a lot of play back and forth. Like Angus moved between two units. He went from the 6 CAC to the 46 CAC. So there's a little bit of play in there. But if you could at least track one unit, then if you could find his papers, then usually it'll tell you if he's bouncing between one or the other.
Okay. I appreciate all your help. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's not easy. And let me tell you, and I hate to say this, guys, but as a female, they're not very receptive to at least my requests. It took a number of years and 4 different archives before somebody finally said, yeah, I can give you a hand. Let's work on that. And I actually cried right there in archives too, because I finally felt seen, because archives 1 blew me off. We don't have those records, even though they knew that they did. St. Louis had blown me off. Kansas City blew me off because I didn't know the lingo. So I would ask for a set of records and they'd be like, those don't exist, when they absolutely do, but I wasn't using the military terminology, so they weren't being helpful. So it's not easy, even if you do know the language, because there's so many nuances to military records, especially modern military records, that, you could try the same search term 5 different ways because of how they organize records.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you very much.
So much good information. Thank you so much. I think we're gonna cut out because we're up over our time, and I want to be
Sorry.
respectful of your time and let you get some rest and heal up from your cold. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing so much information about military records. I know I have a couple of pages of notes, and I hope you all do at home. If anybody needs those links again, for the handouts, I'm going to paste them one more time in the chat. If you didn't get a chance to download them, now's your chance to click and open those up. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We're going to go ahead and end the meeting for all. I'll stop recording